Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Stefan. Thanks to everyone who's helped to organize this great event, Katja and Sebastian in particular. I'm very excited. The talks that we heard today and yesterday all seemed related to things I'm interested in, which I hope isn't a statement about my narcissism, but is more a statement about how we're interested in similar things. The poster board sessions was very invigorating to me as well. So I've learned a lot over the last 2 days, and it's been inspiring to venture away from my familiar territory in the 19th century. This is something of an anxious point for me. Sebastian approached me years ago about joining his working group, but I was worried that I was too much of a historicist, too committed to the 19th century to be of much use to narrative theorists. Today we'll test the hypothesis that I'm useless, and it may turn out to be false. Lately I've been interested in the relationship between information and literature, or one might say, between data and narrative, which is often taken to be a 21st century topic, but actually has deep historical roots. With the dominance of big data, big tech in the STEM fields, and with the rise of statistical literary criticism and standardized metrics in the humanities, literary critics might feel that they face unprecedented pressures in our information age. Of course, many literary scholars have embraced the potential of information technology and information theory. But the historical relationship between literature and data has gone largely unexplored. I think there are at least two primary reasons for this. The first is the presentist orientation of much thinking about information and data. We're told that the internet has changed everything, that our information revolution is a radical epistemic break, that, as Lev Manovich has argued, databases are a new form of cultural expression and a stark alternative to narrative. Besides such presentism, the second reason we lack a robust understanding of the relationship between data and literature is that they are frequently taken to be incommensurate or fundamentally at odds. Literary narrative is typically associated with subjectivity, linear sequence, affect, beauty, and wonder. Data, by contrast, is often regarded as objective, reconfigurable, logic-based, instrumental, and disenchanting. Such dualistic thinking is why distant reading is so controversial. It's why humanists tend to be instinctively opposed to bureaucracy, standardization, and calculative logic. It's why the two cultures divide between science and literature has proven to be so recalcitrant. Jared Gardner in his talk quoted Scott McCloud's definition of comics as, quote, conveying information and/or producing an aesthetic response. This and/or represents a kind of dominant dualism between information and aesthetics. They're seen as opposed, or at least different in a very significant way. So not long ago, I went to dinner with a group of scientists. And when it came time to divvy up the bill, I said, I'm an English professor, somebody else do the math. And there was a little bit of chuckling, but why did I say this? I'm perfectly capable of adding and dividing. I actually want to challenge the data-literature split, and yet it's so easy to accede to its prejudices. I went home filled with shame. But on further reflection, it may not have been my fault. I blame cultural stereotypes, the boring accountant, the emotionally stunted tech genius, the poet who lives by intuition and passion, the storyteller who reveals interior truths that statistics cannot explain. I blame some brilliant scholars, Manovich, Mary Poovey, Friedrich Kittler, for placing literature and data in opposition. I blame post-structuralists who follow Nietzsche in discounting the authority of objectivity and empiricism. And I also blame the Frankfurt School for supercharging Weber, when setting aesthetics against calculation. I blame Heidegger, Wittgenstein, Stanley Cavell for helping literary critics make arguments against scientism. I blame new critics like Cleanth Brooks, who defined poetry against information, and related aestheticians like F.R. Leavis, who wrote, quote, "Life cannot be aggregated or equated or dealt with quantitatively in any way." I blame Carlyle, who takes science to, quote, "destroy wonder," and in its stead substitute mensuration and numeration. I blame Coleridge, who abhorred dividing literary text into disarticulated units. I blame Thoreau, Melville, Dickinson, and Dickens for satirizing efforts to measure the world. Maybe I blame the entire 19th century, as well as the spread of a romantic ideology that sets literature against these developments. I blame my dad, who was a chemist, my brother, who was a chemist, and myself for not measuring up to them. So there's a lot of blame to go around when tracing the literature-data divide. But there's also a counter-narrative in the 19th century, which I'll address in three ways today. First, I'll sketch some 19th century context from Britain and the United States that suggest how literature and literary practices became entangled with data-driven methods. I call this largely neglected development the accounting of literature. Many thinkers objected to the accounting of literature in ways that feel familiar today, but others were more open to the entanglement of narrative and data and can stand as counterexamples. Second, I'll turn to British and American 19th century adventure novels for an extended discussion of how data can play a crucial role in the making of literary narrative. Adventure novels, which are often set in literal borderlands, challenge the separation of data and literature. Here, Robert Louis Stevenson's Treasure Island will serve as a case study. Thirdly, and finally, since it's been a full day, and because one can't live forever in the 19th century, I'll end with an example that moves us closer to the present, Steven Spielberg's film, Indiana Jones, Raiders of the Lost Ark. So, part one, a sampling of 19th century materials beginning with some paired artifacts. This is an 1839 study of book ownership among working class families in Bristol. It's typical of early sociological work that emerged in the early 19th century and circulated in the Anglo-American press. It's an effort to understand literature and literary practices through numbers and quantification. This is Charles Dickens' response to such studies in his full report of the first meeting of the Mudfog Association for the Advancement of Everything. Mr. Slug stated to the section the result of some calculations he had made regarding the state of infant education among the middle classes of London. And here are the children's book zones. Jack the Giant Killer, 7,943. Ditto and the Beanstalk, 8,000. Ditto and 11 Brothers. Ditto and Jill, for a total of 21,407. He found the proportion of Robinson Crusoes to Philip Quarles was as 4.5 to 1, and the preponderance of Valentine and Orsons over Goody Two-Shoes was as 3 1/8 of the former to 1/2 of 1 of the latter. A comparison of 7 champions with Simple Simons gave the same result. The president complimented the honorable member and dwelt upon the immense and urgent necessity of storing the minds of children with nothing but facts and figures. The satire here is heavy-handed enough, but even as Dickens ironically juxtaposes the blunt positivism of data-based methods with the imaginative joys of children's literature, notice that the book titles are already entangled with quantitative discourse: 7 Champions, Goody Two-Shoes, Jack and his 11 Brothers. Here's another satire mocking the accounting of literature. This particular example ridicules both poets, who are up to no good, and attempts to understand poets through data in a way that radically reduces the experience of writing poetry. I particularly like the final category, uncertain, which suggests the limits of data-based inquiry. I also have a suspicion that Poe wrote this, but I can't prove it. This is an image from Jacob Abbott's The Harper Establishment, a book-length, highly technical account of the Harper Brothers printing factory and warehouse. Abbott provides his reader with ample statistics: how many books the Harper's factory produces, how much time it takes to produce them, how much they are worth, how much they weigh, how many workers are employed, etc. The building represented here replaced Harper's old printing house, which burned down in 1853, along with hundreds of Herman Melville's unsold novels. Harper Brothers also published Harper's Magazine, in which the following Melville short story appeared. This excerpt from The Paradise of Bachelors and Tartarus of Maids describes a visit to a dehumanizing paper factory. The narrator writes, I found myself standing in a spacious place, intolerably lighted by long rows of windows. At rows of blank-looking counters sat rows of blank-looking girls with blank white folders in their blank hands, all blankly folding blank paper. In one corner stood some huge frame of ponderous iron, with a vertical thing like a piston periodically rising and falling upon a heavy wooden block. Melville most likely had the new Harper's building in mind when he wrote this. If we go back, we can see on the second floor women working at the printing presses. Abbott writes, her duty is to feed the press with paper. The fourth floor has, in Abbott's words, quote, girls who sit at long tables folding paper. And the piston-like finishing presses are on the sixth floor. It's fairly obvious that Melville is critiquing the mass production and standardization of papermaking, and by extension, the field of literature and literary production. Here's an image from a book by the English professor Lucius Sherman. In keeping with his larger project of analyzing literature as data, this graph tracks the lengths of sentences in a Thomas Macaulay essay. The x-axis registers each successive sentence. The y-axis is the number of words. Elsewhere, Sherman calculates the ratio of word types, counts metaphors in famous novels, and compares the number of stressed to unstressed syllables in poems. His premise is that aesthetics can be measured, standardized, and reverse engineered. And such methods prompted complaints, such as this piece from the novelist Frank Norris, at the time an undergraduate at the University of California, Berkeley. Norris writes, classification is the one thing desirable in the eyes of the professors of literature of the University of California. The student is set to work counting metaphors in a given passage. This is actually true, tabulating them, separating them from similes, comparing the results. The conclusion of the whole matter is that the literary courses of the University of California do not develop literary instincts. So as we can see, the 19th century rendered literature and literary practices as data. And under a broad-based dualistic logic, such rendering was associated with a kind of instrumental, dehumanizing, joyless, disarticulating positivism set in opposition to the qualities of literary narrative, imagination, formal unity, subjectivity, affect, and wonder. But some 19th century literary thinkers did not condemn the accounting of literature. They even found a kind of enchantment and pleasure on the borderlands of data and narrative. So Henry David Thoreau made this map and included it in Walden. Some readers take it as a satire of empiricism, as an absurd effort to measure the immeasurable meanings of the pond. But Thoreau was a surveyor and a natural scientist, a committed gatherer of data, and we can read Walden as a book that combines data and narrative while also gauging the differences between them. This passage from Moby Dick lists the quantities of gin and beer required for a whaling voyage. Ishmael writes, quote, most statistical tables are parchingly dry in the reading, not so in the present case. Here and elsewhere in Moby Dick, Melville finds aesthetic pleasure in data, and he likes to share it with his readers. Fanny Fern included this image of a stock certificate in her popular novel, Ruth Hall. Ruth begins the novel as a naive romantic poet, but comes to master the calculative business of authorship. This certificate for 100 shares of bank stock shows her ability to flourish simultaneously in gender-coded domains of literature and data. This passage is from Anthony Trollope's autobiography. He's talking about how he wrote so many novels so quickly. It still is my custom to write with my watch before me and to require from myself 250 words every quarter of an hour. I have found that the 250 words have been forthcoming as regularly as my watch went. This division of time allowed me to produce over 10 pages of an ordinary novel volume a day, and if kept up through 10 months, would have given as its results 3 novels of 3 volumes each in the year. Trollope was a novelist and a high-ranking postal official, a successful artist and a skilled bureaucrat. This passage bridges the literary data divide, but also did lasting damage to his aesthetic reputation. So, our historical materials suggest various reactions to the accounting of literature. Though many 19th century authors resisted the entanglement of data and narrative, others found in it the potential for humor, meaning, drama, and enchantment. And here we might recall how Carolyn Levine mentioned that statistics and novels are not at odds, and we might think of Sarah Link's discussion of lists, an informational form that can also be put in the service of narrative suspense. This entanglement of data and literature is particularly evident in British and American adventure novels of the long 19th century, from deserted island narratives to American frontier fiction to the exploration fantasies of Edgar Allan Poe, H. Rider Haggard, Arthur Conan Doyle, and Edgar Rice Burroughs. Scholarship on the adventure novel genre tends to focus on its disavowals of modernity. As much as authors attempt to escape civilization, they cannot help but carry and duplicate their ideologies. In some cases, however, adventure fiction can actually be acutely self-conscious in exploring the relationship between myth and modernity, literature and information, data and narrative. At least this is the case with Robert Louis Stevenson's 1883 novel, Treasure Island, an apparent escape from the accounting of literature that actually stages a complex encounter between numbers and aesthetic enchantment. Reflecting on Robinson Crusoe while he worked on Treasure Island, Stevenson wrote of Crusoe's salvaged items, quote, "The bare enumeration stirs the blood." And if we recall Robinson Crusoe, there are lots of lists of the things he has. And for Stevenson, this was enchanting. So much so that he went on to invest Treasure Island with his own stirring enumerations. The absence of quantification matters at the start of the novel, when the pirate Billy Bones takes up tyrannical evidence at the Hawkins family inn. Mr. Hawkins, the father of our young narrator Jim, dies before settling Bones's account, thus setting the stage for Jim's maturation as numbers drive the coming-of-age plot. After Jim's no-account father passes away, Billy Bones in turn dies before paying his bill. And so Mrs. Hawkins tries to take from the sailor's chest the 7 guineas he owes. The problem is that she will not settle for, quote, a fraction more or less than is her due, but she can only make her count in English money, whereas Bones's coins come from all over the world. Jim and his mother finally flee, though not before Jim grabs Bones's oilskin packet to, in his words, square the count. Jim is taking on the role of his father. He is accepting his initiation into an adult world of numbers and calculation. But his coming of age will also entail a recognition of the limits of data and accounting. Bones's oilskin packet contains a book that has a map to the treasure of the mythic Captain Flint. But if Bones's book is the gateway to narrative wonder, it is first and foremost, as Stevenson calls it, an account book containing geographic coordinates, financial figures, and a table for converting currency. Like the coded messages of Poe's The Gold Bug, which influenced Stevenson, Bones's ledger reduces the stuff of romance to numbers in seeming anticipation of Weberian disenchantment. Yet as with Poe, numerical data in Treasure Island opens up imaginative possibilities to readers of sufficient literary imagination. Importantly, it is the romantic Squire Trelawney, not the scientific Dr. Livesey, who first cracks the code of Bones's book. The adventure that ensues further indicates how information and literature, data and narrative can work in enchanting conjunction. Flint's treasure, the very object of fantasy, is repeatedly referred to as 700,000 pounds. And numbers work their way into Stevenson's pirate ballads. One man returned of her crew alive, what put to sea with 75, and most famously, 15 men on a dead man's chest, yo-ho-ho, and a bottle of rum. Here are two other examples from Treasure Island. When the pirates first attacked the Loyalist stockade, the heroic Captain Smollett reckons the proportion of good guys to bad by subtracting casualties and wounded. 5 against 3 leaves us 4 to 9, he says. That's better odds than we had at starting. We were 7 to 19 then. And when Jim earlier discovers the mutinous plot, he writes, there were only 7 out of the 26 sailors on whom we knew we could rely, and out of those 7, 1 was a boy, so that the grown men on our side were 6 to their 19. With Long John Silver calculating interest rates, and Jim enumerating time and topography on the island, Treasure Island can be read as an escapist novel that actually furthers the disciplinary purposes not only of global capitalism and imperial bureaucracy, but of the data-driven methods fundamental to both. And yet the numbers that appear throughout Treasure Island also advertise the limits of their explanatory power, as Stevenson displays a tension that John Guillory sets at the center of novelistic aesthetics, the urge to both leverage empirical particulars and to differentiate literature from the data-rich genres of science and political economy. Thus, Smollett's calculations about the stockade battle feel fatuous, for he himself has been wounded. Surely the stalwart captain counts for more than one of the drunken, feckless pirates. Jim suggests a similar point when first calculating the odds of the mutiny. This is our second quote here. How should one count? That is, whether one can count on a boy is a central question that Treasure Island resolves, not with blunt statistics, but through narrative unfoldings. Data is absolutely crucial to Treasure Island. It matters how many pirates there are, how many guns they have, how far the tree is from the fort, how many hours have passed, how much gold there is. But such data needs to be aesthetically arranged. It requires literary narrative, and even then, it can only do so much. The climax of Treasure Island is Jim's description of Flint's treasure that comes at the end of the book. And this is a long quote, but I'll kind of give it a little time here. It was a strange collection, like Billy Bones's hoard for the diversity of coinage, but so much larger and so much more varied than I think I never had more pleasure than in sorting them. English, French, Spanish, Portuguese, Georges and Louises, doubloons and double guineas and moidras and sequins, the pictures of all the kings of Europe for the last 100 years, strange oriental pieces stamped with what looked like wisps of string or bits of spider's web, round pieces and square pieces, and pieces bored through the middle as if to wear them around your neck. Nearly every variety of money in the world must, I think, have found a place in that collection. And as for number, I am sure they were like the autumn leaves, so that my back ached with stooping and my fingers with sorting them out. This wonderful passage contains stirring enumerations, but numeracy gives way to an unaccountability in which counts cannot be squared. Flint's treasure is irreducible to a single unit of value, as Jim's description grows increasingly lyrical, subjective, affective, and, in a word, literary. Coins conjure romantic histories in faraway lands. They become pieces of jewelry with totemic power. The data-driven job of sorting and calculating is painful, but also intensely pleasurable in the manner of the sublime. And as for number, in Jim's words, he can only equate the hall to autumn leaves. 700,000 pounds can fire the imagination, but such data cannot in itself convey the aesthetic pleasures of pirate booty. And yet neither can the narrative of Treasure Island succeed without a sense of the numbers involved. In a sample of 105 adventure novels between 1820 and 1920, the frequency of key words associated with accounting, Arabic numerals, number words, words linked with mathematical operations, is, according to my modest statistical study, significantly higher than that of a control sample of non-adventure novels from the time. That the genre is particularly committed to stirring enumerations is suggested by the last sentence of Treasure Island, which is itself an allusion to Robinson Crusoe. As Jim straddles the line between his boyhood and maturity, and as Stevenson occupies the borderlands between data and literature, Jim recalls the repeated cries of Captain Flint's parrot, "Pieces of 8, pieces of 8." It's the final line of the novel, the accounting of literature, the stirring enumerations that Stevenson finds enchanting. So, my final section, the interplay between myth and modernity, literature and information, narrative and data, extends beyond the 19th century. Steven Spielberg's 1981 blockbuster, Indiana Jones, Raiders of the Lost Ark, borrows heavily from adventure novel tropes, while also reenacting the genre's negotiation of data and narrative, this time under a different kind of mass media. This is particularly evident when Indiana Jones, played by Harrison Ford playing Han Solo, recounts the story of the Ark of the Covenant in a university library. I'm going to show an extended clip here. It takes about 3 minutes. But keep an eye out for the shifting entanglements of Christian mythology and accounting, of narrative and data, of science and literature, of calculation and enchantment, and very literary enchantment. And I'll also ask you to notice the blackboard in the background. For some of you, this will be a trip down memory lane.
Well, the city of Tanis is one of the possible resting places of the Lost Ark.
The Lost Ark?
Yeah, the Ark of the Covenant, the chest the Hebrews used to carry around the Ten Commandments.
What do you mean, Commandments? You're talking about the Ten Commandments?
Yes, the actual Ten Commandments, the original stone tablets that Moses brought down out of Mount Horeb and smashed, if you believe in that sort of thing. You guys ever go to Sunday school?
Well,
Oh, look. The Hebrews took the broken pieces and put them in the Ark. When they settled in Canaan, they put the Ark in a place called the Temple of Solomon.
in Jerusalem.
Where it stayed for many years, until all of a sudden, whoosh, is gone.
Where?
Well, nobody knows where or when.
However, an Egyptian pharaoh
Shishak.
Yes, invaded the city of Jerusalem around about 980 BC, and he may have taken the ark back to the city of Tanis and hidden it in a secret chamber called the Well of Souls.
Secret chamber.
However, about a year after the pharaoh had returned to Egypt, the city of Tanis was consumed by the desert in a sandstorm which lasted a whole year, wiped clean by the wrath of God.
Obviously, we've come to the right men. Now, you seem to know all about this Tanis.
No, not really. Ravenwood is the real expert. Abner did the first serious work on Tanis, collected some of its relics. It was his obsession, really. But he never found the city.
Frankly, we're somewhat suspicious of Mr. Ravenwood, American being mentioned so prominently in a secret Nazi cable.
Oh, rubbish. Ravenwood's no Nazi.
Well, what did the Nazis want him for, then?
Well, obviously, the Nazis are looking for the headpiece to the Staff of Ra, and they think Abner's got it.
What exactly is a headpiece to the Staff of Ra?
Well, the staff is just a stick, I don't know, about this big. Nobody really knows for sure how high, and it's capped with an elaborate headpiece in the shape of the sun, with a crystal in the center. And what you did was you take the staff to a special room in Tanis, a map room with a miniature of the city all laid out on the floor. And if you put the staff in a certain place at a certain time of day, the sun shone through here and made a beam that came down on the floor here and gave you the exact location of the Well of the Souls.
Where the Ark of the Covenant was kept, right?
Which is exactly what the Nazis are looking for.
Now, what does this ark look like?
There's a picture of it right here. That's it.
Good God.
Yes, that's just what the Hebrews thought.
Now what's that supposed to be coming out of there?
Lightning. Fire. Power of God or something.
Beginning to understand Hitler's interest in this thing.
Oh, yes. The Bible speaks of the Ark leveling mountains and laying waste to entire regions. An army which carries the Ark before it is invincible.
Okay, so our clip begins with a dualism, the opposition of narrative wonder and rational bureaucracy. But soon the dualism gives way, or starts to give way, to a kind of synthesis. Indiana Jones combines a passion for myth with an archaeologist's commitment to science. Oddly prominent in the background is a blackboard with algebra problems. When Indy flips the board to its obverse side, he does so to diagram how the staff of Ra will reveal the placement of the Ark according to astronomical and geometrical principles, thus suggesting that accounting and enchantment are two sides of the same coin. The ultimate goal, of course, is finding the Ark, rumored to contain the pieces of the Ten Commandments, a literal touchstone for Western literature that is also an enumerated list, as if it embodies some lost numerological synthesis of narrative and data. And yet such synthesis proves elusive in Raiders of the Lost Ark, especially in the denouement of the film. Indy has successfully retrieved the Ark, but the US government takes possession of it. Indy's last line is, quote, "bureaucratic fools, they don't know what they have." And then he walks out of the government building with his romantic interest, Marion Ravenwood, played by Karen Allen. It would seem that modern disenchantment triumphs in the end over spirit, myth, beauty, and enchantment. The mythic Ark is subsumed by the accounting of literature. Or is it? And that's not a rhetorical question. Here's the final scene of the film. I know Sebastian wants me to let that whole song play, but we're gonna have to finish up here. So this final clip can almost stand as a synopsis of Adorno and Horkheimer's claim in the culture industry that despite, quote, the blindness and muteness of the data to which positivism reduces the world, data-driven systems arrogate a power that, quote, makes them like their extreme opposite, incantations. After the faceless worker packs the Ark of the Covenant in a crate stenciled Army Intel 9906753, the credits of the movie roll as the crate disappears into an immense warehouse, stacked ever higher with innumerable crates extending beyond our field of vision. This ending, which is probably intended to echo the conclusion to Citizen Kane, shows the reduction of literature to information, of narrative wonder to data. Retrieving God's word does not require prayerful exegesis or Indy's heroism or some sort of literary interpretation. It requires an index to master the database. Under the literature-data divide, to put the enchanted object of myth into a numbered box seems a kind of outrage, like reducing a poem or group of novels to statistics, like using standardized tests to determine one's literary learning, like deploying a formula to measure the value of a humanistic education. There are certainly reasons to fear for the fate of literature in our data-driven age. And yet I find the ending of Raiders of the Lost Ark strangely and unaccountably pleasurable, just as the stirring enumerations of Treasure Island are part of the appeal, just as I find a kind of wonder in Thoreau's map, in the data dumping of Moby Dick, in Trollope's description of his writing regimen, and even in Lucius Sherman's graph. Under a strain of postmodernism, aesthetic enchantment lurks in data systems, in the sprawling libraries of Borges and Eco, in the oversaturated semiotic conspiracies of Pynchon, in the swamp bureaucracies of DeLillo, Saramago, and Foster Wallace, and in the unmappable networks of cyberfiction. Raiders of the Lost Ark displays what might be taken as a similar postmodern commitment that we can trace not just into the 20th century, but back into the 19th century. As is so often the case, we find previous inhabitants in the borderlands between narrative and data. Thank you.